The entire estate held its breath when the housekeeper's 3-year-old daughter innocently used a crayon to draw on the Mafia Boss's face. Everyone thought Lorenzo would fly into a rage, but a few seconds later, the man who made everyone tremble in fear did something unthinkable, leaving every witness present in stunned silence. 6 years before that impossible moment in the office, Lorenzo De Luca had been a different man. At 39, he stood at the head of the De Luca family, the oldest and most feared name in the Chicago underworld. His holdings stretched from the shipping docks along Lake Michigan to the private clubs of the Gold Coast. Rival bosses spoke his name carefully, the way men speak of a loaded weapon left on a table. Politicians took his calls before their wives. And inside the tall iron gates of the De Luca estate, even his closest lieutenants would stop at the threshold of his private study, straighten their jackets, and knock twice before daring to step in. He had not always been that cold. 6 years earlier, this same man had come home each evening to a house filled with the sound of a small piano being played badly by a woman he loved. His wife had been the only person in the world who could laugh at his silences until they cracked. Their daughter had been 3 years old, dark curls, one missing front tooth, and a habit of hiding her father's cufflinks in the pockets of his coats. Lorenzo had built 2 lives with his own hands, one in the boardrooms and back alleys where the De Luca name meant fear, and one behind these walls, where he was only a husband, only a father, only a man who tied a small red ribbon around a smaller wrist every Sunday morning before Mass. He had believed he could keep the 2 worlds apart. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a car carrying his wife and daughter left the coastal road in a stretch of fog no one could later fully explain. There were no witnesses. There were no skid marks that told a clean story. The police called it an accident. Lorenzo, who knew his enemies by name, called it something else, but he could never prove it. That was the wound that did not close. Not the loss itself, terrible as it was, but the ambiguity behind it. Every night, for 6 years, he had lain awake asking the same question. If they had not been the wife and daughter of a mafia boss, would they still be alive? He never found an answer. So he built a prison out of the question and lived inside it. Within a month of the funerals, he locked the door of his daughter's bedroom. The toys, the small pink shoes, the drawings taped to the wall, everything sealed away as if the room itself had died with her. He gave orders that no one was to speak their names in the house. He took down the photographs. He stopped attending Christmas Mass. He stopped sleeping in the bed they had shared. And he made himself a rule that he repeated in his mind the way other men repeat prayers. To love someone is to hand your enemies a weapon shaped exactly like that person. He would not love again. He would not want a child. He would not give the world one more soft place to strike. For 6 long, hollow years, the De Luca estate had remained a house of dark, polished wood, drawn curtains, and quiet armed men, a house where nothing living ever wandered in by mistake. It was into that hollow house, only a few months after the funerals, that a young woman named Vivian first walked through the servants' entrance, carrying a single small suitcase. She was 24 then. She had grown up in a modest apartment above a laundromat on the west side of the city, the older of 2 sisters, raised by a tired mother who worked double shifts, and a father who came and went as it suited him. Vivian had learned early that no one was going to hand her anything. She had left school to help pay the rent. She had scrubbed floors in 3 different houses before this one. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men on the street, but she was clean, quiet, punctual, and possessed of a talent she did not know. Had a name. She noticed things. She noticed that Mr. De Luca took his coffee black in the morning, but with a single spoon of honey after dark. She noticed that the second stair from the top of the west staircase creaked, and she learned to avoid it because the sound seemed to wake him from wherever his mind had gone. She noticed the mornings when his eyes were red-rimmed and his jaw was tighter than usual, and on those mornings she left the newspaper folded a certain way on the sideboard and did not knock. Years passed. 1 turned into 3. 3 turned into 5. She rose through the small hierarchy of the household, without ever seeming to try. The other maids came and went. Vivian stayed. She was the one Lorenzo tolerated in the corridor outside his study, when he could not tolerate anyone else. She was the one who knew, without being told, that on the 11th of every June the curtains in the dining room were to be drawn from morning to midnight. She was one of the very few people in the world who understood that the man everyone called cold was not cold at all. He was hollowed out. Somewhere between the 2nd year and the 3rd, without asking her own permission, Vivian fell in love with him. It was a love with no witnesses and no future. He had never once looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he wants. He had never touched her hand in passing, never said her name in that lower register, never given her any reason at all. But she watched him carry his grief through year after year, and she told herself a private story to survive it, that she had been beside him in the worst years of his life, and if the day ever came when he was finally ready to open his heart again, the first person he would see would be her. She waited. She kept waiting. Underneath that waiting, an older shadow moved. She had a younger sister, Sophia, softer, prettier, with the kind of quiet warmth that made strangers want to protect her. As children, Vivian had watched aunts, neighbors, teachers, boys, everyone turn instinctively toward Sophia, the way faces turned toward the sun. Vivian had learned to work for every scrap of attention she got. Sophia had only needed to exist. Vivian had buried that comparison for years. She did not know, standing polished and patient in Lorenzo's hallway, that the buried thing was about to be exhumed. Across the city, in a very different life, that younger sister was learning what it cost to be loved by the wrong man. Sophia had never chased attention the way Vivian had. She had chased tenderness. And when a young man named Joseph walked into the diner, where she waited tables and told her, on their second conversation, that she had the kind of face a man could build a whole life around, she had believed him. He had been charming then. He had been patient. He had brought her a paperback of poems on their third date and had remembered, 6 months later, which one had made her cry. Sophia had told herself she had found what her own mother had never found, a man who stayed. They married in a small church on a bright afternoon. A year later, Emma was born. At 3 years old, Emma was the light Sophia carried through every room. She was small and round-cheeked and utterly fearless. The sort of child who walked up to stray dogs and asked their names, who tugged at the coats of strangers in the grocery store because she had something important to tell them about a butterfly. She laughed loud. She loved everyone. She did not yet know that the world contained anything worth being afraid of. Sophia meant to keep it that way. She could not. Joseph lost his job at the freight yard a few months after Emma's second birthday. He said it would only be for a while. Then he began drinking again. Then he found the card rooms behind the barber shop on Halsted. And after that he found the ones with worse company and higher stakes. The bills stopped being paid. Then the argument started. Then the argument stopped being about bills and started being about her, where she had been, whom she had spoken to, why she had looked at the neighbor for 1 second too long. He took the small envelope of tips she kept in the flour tin. He took the second one she hid in Emma's diaper bag. The first time he raised his hand, he cried afterward and swore on his mother's grave that it would never happen again. It happened again. Sophia stayed. She stayed because she still remembered the man who had brought her a paperback of poems, and because she believed, the way tired women in her situation are trained to believe, that if she was only patient enough, he would come back. The night that broke that belief did not begin with him. It began with 3 men she had never seen before, standing in her kitchen at 10:30 at night, quietly telling Joseph how much time he had left to find the money he owed. Emma was already asleep down the hallway. Sophia stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hand, and she watched one of those 3 men, the shortest one, the one with a scar across his knuckles, turn his head very slowly and look toward the sound of her daughter breathing in the next room. He looked at Emma the way a man looks at a debt he intends to collect. Sophia understood everything in a single second. She did not sleep that night. She packed a canvas bag in the dark, lifted Emma out of the small bed, still warm and still dreaming, and stepped out of that apartment before the sun came up. She had no money worth naming, no job, no plan, and nowhere on earth to go. She had one name left, her sister. The name Sophia, carried through the pre-dawn streets, belonged to a sister she had not spoken to in more than 4 years. She knocked on the servants' entrance of the DeLuca estate a little after 7 in the morning. Emma balanced on her hip, the canvas bag hanging heavy on her other shoulder. When the door opened and Vivian stood there in her pressed gray uniform, both women went still. Vivian took in the bruise fading along her sister's jaw, the exhaustion, the child. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. "Come inside," she said quietly, "before someone sees you standing here." She led them through the back corridor to her own small room above the kitchen. She poured Sophia a glass of water. She sat Emma on the edge of the bed and gave her a wrapped piece of caramel candy from a tin she kept in her drawer. And she listened, without interrupting once, as Sophia told her in a low voice about Joseph, about the debts, about the men in her kitchen, about the way one of them had looked at Emma. When Sophia was finished, Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "I will speak to Mr. DeLuca," she said. "I will ask him if there is a place for you here." She approached Lorenzo that same afternoon. She did not tell him the whole story. She told him only that her sister needed honest work, that the woman was quiet and would give no trouble, and that there was a small child. Lorenzo, in the middle of signing a stack of shipping papers, barely looked up. "Whatever you think is best," he said. "Keep her out of my way." That was the end of the conversation for him. He had already forgotten it before Vivian had closed the door behind her. Sophia and Emma moved into a small room at the back of the servants' wing that same evening. It had one narrow bed, one window looking onto the kitchen garden, and a chipped porcelain wash basin. To Sophia, it felt like a cathedral. Vivian helped her unpack. She showed her the laundry schedule, the linen cupboards, the back stairs. She gave her 3 gray uniforms and a pair of soft-soled shoes. She was, in every visible way, the older sister she had always been. And then, standing in the doorway that first night with the lamp turned low, she gave Sophia one instruction in a voice that was gentler than her words. "Keep Emma away from Mr. DeLuca. Do you understand me? He does not want children around him. He has his reasons. If she disturbs him even once, we will all be out on the street by morning." Sophia nodded. She would have nodded to anything. Vivian did not tell her the second reason. Vivian did not tell herself the second reason either, though it sat quietly behind her ribs like a small stone. She had spent years building a private world inside this house with the man at its center, a world of small routines, small observations, small hopes. She did not want a bright, laughing 3-year-old walking into that world and rearranging it. Sophia meant to obey, but Emma was 3. By the second afternoon, she had discovered the kitchen garden, the koi pond, and a butterfly the color of butter. By the third, she was carrying a small tin box of crayons everywhere she went, and every closed door in that enormous house looked, to her, like a question waiting to be answered. It happened on the 4th afternoon. Sophia had been called to the laundry annex behind the estate to help fold a mountain of table linen for a dinner. Lorenzo was hosting the following night. She had brought Emma with her, seated the little girl on a wooden stool in the corner with a tin box of crayons and a stack of thick paper, and told her, in the careful voice mothers use when they mean it, to stay right there until Mama came back for her. Emma had nodded solemnly. Emma had meant it too, for perhaps 15 minutes. Then a crayon rolled off the stool and under the folding table, and Emma slid down after it. Then a butterfly the color of butter drifted past the open annex door, and Emma stood up. Then the butterfly turned a corner, and Emma turned with it, holding her tin of crayons pressed flat to her chest with both small hands. The butterfly was gone within a minute. Emma was not. She stopped in a hallway she did not recognize. The floor here was not stone like the one behind the laundry. It was a long, deep red carpet that swallowed the sound of her small shoes. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the color of chocolate, and along them hung oil paintings of stern-faced men in high collars who all seemed to be looking down at her at once. The air smelled different, too, like polished leather and old cigars, and the inside of the box her mother kept her wedding photograph in. Emma tilted her head back and studied one of the painted men for a long moment. He did not smile. She decided she did not like him and moved on. The hallway kept going. It turned again. Every door she passed was tall and closed, and made of the same dark, heavy wood, with the same brass handle set at the same height above her head. To her, they all looked like the same door, and none of them looked like any door she had seen before. She was not frightened yet. She was 3. But her lower lip had begun to gather itself the way it did before a small wobble, and she stopped in the middle of the long red carpet and clutched her tin of crayons tighter, and thought, very seriously, about crying. Then she saw the light. At the far end of the corridor, one of the tall doors was not quite closed. A narrow band of warm yellow lamplight spilled out along the carpet like a path. Emma walked toward it. She placed one small hand flat against the dark wood. She pushed. Beyond that door was the one room in the entire estate that even Lorenzo's most trusted men would not enter without knocking twice and waiting to be spoken to. It was his private study, a long room, lined floor to ceiling with books he no longer read, dominated by a black lacquered desk, lit by a single low lamp. Behind that desk, Lorenzo DeLuca sat with a fountain pen in his hand, signing a stack of shipping papers. He heard the smallest possible sound, the tap of small shoes on wood where the carpet ended. He looked up. Standing just inside his door was a child of perhaps 3 years old, honey curls falling across her forehead, a tin box of crayons pressed tightly against her chest, 2 very round eyes looking straight at him without a trace of fear. For a long, long moment, Lorenzo did not breathe. Fate rarely knocks. It leans, sometimes, against a door someone forgot to close. The little girl standing inside his door was not his daughter. Lorenzo understood that in the same second he saw her. The face was different. The mouth was different. The way she stood, chest pushed forward and chin lifted a little, belonged to a child he had never met before. But the tin box of crayons pressed flat against her small chest, the honey curls, the 3 years of her, those were a language his body remembered. For 6 years he had trained himself not to feel that language. The first thing he did was reach for the small brass bell on the corner of his desk. He would ring it. Someone would come. The child would be lifted, apologized for, removed. The door would close. The room would go back to being what it had been. His hand did not quite reach the bell. The child tilted her head to one side, the way small birds do, and asked a question in a bright and perfectly ordinary voice. "Do you not have anyone to play with?" Lorenzo's hand stopped in the air above the bell. No one, in all his life, had ever asked him that. Not his lieutenants. Not the men who owed him their careers. Not the priests who came at Christmas. Not the woman he had married. It was not a question adults ever thought to ask a man like him. He did not answer. He did not know how to answer. The child took his silence as permission for something else entirely. She walked across the deep rug toward the enormous leather chair set in front of his desk. She set her tin of crayons carefully on the seat. Then she took the back of the chair in both of her small hands and, with an effort that made her whole small body tremble, dragged the heavy chair a few inches closer to the desk. Then a few inches more. Lorenzo watched her do this. He did not move to help her. He did not move to stop her either. She climbed up. She knelt on the seat. She looked at the neat stack of thick, cream-colored shipping documents at his left elbow, chose the top page as though it had been placed there for her, and pulled it in front of her. She opened the tin. She began to draw. Her tongue crept out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. Her small brow furrowed. A green crayon squeaked softly against expensive paper. Lorenzo, who had spent 39 years learning how to control a room, sat frozen behind his own desk, and could not, for reasons he did not understand, make himself lift a hand. Then the child looked up. She looked at him for a long, considering moment. She reached across the desk with the green crayon and drew a slow, deliberate, wavering line down the center of his left cheek. At that exact instant, two women reached the doorway. Sophia arrived first. She saw her daughter kneeling on Lorenzo De Luca's chair. She saw the green line down his face. She dropped to her knees in the corridor before she had entirely understood what she was seeing, both hands flat on the floor, her voice cracking as she begged forgiveness. Vivian arrived one step behind her and did not drop. Vivian stood in the doorway and did not breathe. And then both women saw the impossible thing. Lorenzo De Luca was laughing. It was quiet. It was brief. It was low in his chest and rough at the edges, as though it had traveled a very long way to reach the surface. "It is all right," he said. "Take her to eat." Something small and quiet began to crack in Vivian's chest that she would never be able to seal again. For 3 days after that afternoon in the study, Lorenzo did everything a man of his kind of discipline could do to erase what had happened. He rose earlier. He left the estate before breakfast. He took his meetings at the club on Rush Street or in the private back room of the restaurant on Taylor. He returned only after the servants' wing had gone dark, and he went in through the side entrance so he would not have to walk past the kitchen door where a certain small pair of shoes might be sitting on the mat. He told himself it was reasonable. The child reminded him of things he had spent 6 years not remembering. Each accidental sighting of her, a flash of honey curls at the end of a hallway. The sound of small laughter from the garden was like pressing on a wound just as it had begun to skin over. He was not being cruel. He was being careful. Emma did not know she was being avoided. She was 3. When she heard the deep sound of his car returning through the gate, she ran to whichever window was nearest and pressed her nose against the glass to watch him get out. When she saw him sitting alone in the small pavilion at the far end of the garden with a folder open on his knee, she carried her drawings across the whole long lawn to show him what she had made. She told him, in serious detail, about a striped cat that lived on the wall behind the kitchen and had, in her opinion, secrets. She told him about a dream in which the entire estate was made of birthday cake. She showed him a yellow leaf she had rescued from the fountain and pronounced, with great authority, to be the best leaf in the whole world. She would take his hand, the same hand that men in 3 states were afraid to shake, and tug him with all her 3-year-old strength toward a snail she had discovered on the flagstones. And Lorenzo, who could have shaken her off with 2 fingers, went where she pulled him. One evening she fell asleep on the leather sofa in the corner of his study while he was reviewing a stack of accounts. He noticed it after perhaps an hour. He did not wake her. He signed papers until midnight in a lower kind of quiet than he had known in years. He stopped walking the long way around. Small things began to change in that study, small things that no one commented on, because no one was foolish enough to comment on them. A jar for crayons appeared on a low shelf next to the fireplace. A stack of thick blank paper found its way onto the low table by the sofa. A single small doll with a stitched cotton face took up residence on the arm of the leather chair and was never moved by the cleaning staff, because Vivian had quietly given them instructions not to. Lorenzo began to come home earlier than he needed to. He did not admit this to anyone. He did not admit it to himself. He simply found that the meetings on Rush Street ended sooner than they used to, and that the drive back through the gates felt, in some way, he did not name, like the last hour of a long day, rather than the first hour of another empty night. Vivian saw every one of these small things. Vivian counted them. It happened on a Tuesday, close to 11 at night. Emma had come to the study after dinner with her tin of crayons, and had settled herself on the rug near the sofa without asking permission, the way she now did most evenings. Lorenzo had glanced at her once, said nothing, and gone back to his ledgers. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds in that long, book-lined room had been the soft scratch of his fountain pen and the softer squeak of a green crayon on thick paper. At some point after 10, the crayon had stopped moving. He had not noticed. When he finally looked up from his figures, Emma was curled sideways against the base of the sofa, her cheek pressed to the rug, one small hand still loosely closed around the green crayon she had drawn on his face with weeks earlier. He set his pen down. For a long moment, he only looked at her. Then, quietly, he stood. He crossed the room. He crouched. He slid one arm under her small shoulders and one under the bend of her knees, and he lifted her the way a man lifts something breakable that he does not entirely trust himself to be carrying. Her head tipped naturally against his collar. The green crayon fell from her fingers and rolled once on the rug. He could have rung the small bell. He could have sent for Sophia. He did neither. He carried her out of the study himself. The long corridor between his wing and the servants' wing was lit only by the low amber sconces spaced along the walls. The house at that hour was hushed the way old houses are hushed. The soft tick of a clock somewhere, the distant sound of a kettle in the kitchen, the small creak of wood settling. Lorenzo walked slowly. He held her carefully. He was not thinking anything in particular, which was itself unusual. Halfway down the hallway, Emma stirred against his shoulder. She did not wake. Her eyes did not open. In the deep drift of a 3-year-old's sleep, she made a small, satisfied sound and lifted both of her small arms and looped them, without any conscious thought, around his neck. She turned her face into the fabric of his shoulder. She breathed out, and she murmured one soft word into his collar. "Daddy." Lorenzo stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the long amber hallway holding a sleeping child, and for what felt to him like a very long time, he could not move at all. He could not remember how to make his feet continue forward. He could not remember how to breathe deeply enough to fill his own chest. That one word had traveled 6 years to reach him, and it had reached him. He had not heard it, directed at him. Since the afternoon, a small, dark-haired girl had been strapped into a car seat and driven away and never come back. He closed his eyes. He did not lower her. He did not shift her weight. He simply stood. At the far end of the corridor, Vivian was crossing behind the small side table with a lacquered tray in her hands, carrying a fresh pot of chamomile to her own room. She turned, and she saw the child asleep on his shoulder. She saw the arms around his neck. She saw, most of all, the red rim around his eyes, a thing she had waited more than 6 years to see and had never once seen, in a man she had held vigil over through winter after winter. And she understood, with a cold clarity that surprised even her, that a 3-year-old had crossed a threshold in a few weeks that she herself had not crossed in years. She retreated to her room without a sound. She set the tray down. She sat on the edge of her bed with the lamp off, and she did not go to sleep for a very long time. A small, quiet question began to form itself in the dark. If Emma were not here, could everything go back to the way it was before? After that night in the amber hallway, something in Lorenzo shifted that no one but Vivian noticed at first. He began to ask questions. They were small questions, laid down almost carelessly, the way a man lays down a coin on a table he does not wish to acknowledge sitting at. He would find Sophia stacking clean linens in the corridor and pause on his way past. "She does not eat the crusts of her sandwiches," he would say. "Is that only with me? Or always?" Or, in the garden, when Emma had gone chasing after the striped kitchen cat, "She sleeps hard. Does she wake in the night?" Or once, at the top of the west staircase, more quietly than the others, "She does not startle at loud sounds. Most children her age do." Sophia answered him carefully at first. Then, over the weeks, less carefully, she began to tell him small things without being asked. Emma had once tried to feed a butterfly a piece of bread. Emma believed that thunder was the sound of clouds moving furniture. Emma had a scar on her left knee from a fall she did not remember, but the story of which she demanded be retold at least once a week. And then, one evening in the kitchen while the rain came down against the black windows and Emma was already in bed, Sophia told him the rest. She told him about Joseph, about the man who had brought her a paperback of poems and had, some years later, taken the tips out of Emma's diaper bag, about the arguments that had stopped being about money and started being about her, about the night 3 men had stood in her kitchen, and one of them had looked toward the sound of Emma breathing in the next room. She told it in a low, level voice, without decoration, without asking for pity. Lorenzo did not interrupt her once. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did the right thing," he said finally, "getting her out that night." She did not answer. She did not know what to answer. He did not offer her sympathy. He offered her something rarer. He began, from that evening on, to treat her with a specific and unshowy kind of respect. Not the respect a man gives to a woman he pities, the respect he gave to people he considered strong. Sophia, for her part, began to see him differently too. She watched him sit on the floor of his own study with Emma for 40 minutes, coloring a picture of a house with a red roof, and never once glance at his watch. She noticed, walking the corridor late at night on her way to check on her daughter, that the door to Emma's small room was often quietly cracked open by an inch she had not left it at, as though someone had already passed by and looked in. She caught him pretending to be irritated when Emma climbed onto his lap uninvited, and she noticed that he never once actually lifted her down. One evening after supper, she came into the kitchen for a glass of water and stopped in the doorway. Lorenzo was standing in front of the open refrigerator with the light on his face, reaching for the small glass bottle of milk Emma liked. He could have rung any bell in the house. He had not. He was bent slightly at the waist, the way a father bends. He was not, in that moment, the man the underworld feared. He was a man learning, slowly and without instruction, how to take care of someone again. Something small and warm turned over in Sophia's chest that she did not have a name for. Neither of them named it. But at the far end of the corridor, standing in shadow with a folded towel in her hands, Vivian was already counting every unnamed thing. What Vivian had counted in the shadow of that kitchen doorway did not stay counted for long. By morning it had multiplied into something older, something that had been sleeping in her chest since she was a girl of 9 and had first noticed the way a room brightened when Sophia walked into it. The old ache came back exactly as it had been. She had spent years earning small pieces of a place at Lorenzo's table. Sophia had walked in 1 week ago and been offered the whole chair without asking. Vivian could not permit herself to be seen resenting a child. She was, in her own accounting, still a good sister. She was, in her own accounting, still a decent aunt. So she did not scream. She did not accuse. She began, instead, to make small, careful, invisible adjustments. "The East linens need airing," she would say brightly, catching Sophia by the elbow in the corridor just before 6. "You'll be the whole evening at it, I'm afraid. Do not worry about the kitchen. I will see to Mr. DeLuca's supper myself." She began scheduling the laundry runs in the hours he most often came home. She began finding, or inventing, urgent errands at the far end of the estate, the greenhouse, the wine cellar, the guest wing that had not been used in 2 years that required Sophia and no one else. If Lorenzo returned earlier than expected, she was always the first person he saw when he stepped inside. She made sure of it. To Emma, she used a different tone. She would kneel down in the corridor with a bright, apologetic smile and take the small hands in her own. "Uncle Lorenzo is very busy today. Sweetheart," she would say gently. "He has grown-up work to do. It is not a good time to bother him." She was very careful never to say it more than once a day. She was very careful always to have a piece of caramel candy ready when she said it. She began forgetting small pieces of information. A message that Lorenzo would be home for supper somehow did not reach Sophia until the meal was already cold. A drawing Emma had made specifically for him found its way, in the general shuffle of the household, into a drawer in the linen room and stayed there. None of it worked. Emma found him anyway. Every time, she would slip her small hand out of Vivian's and simply walk, with the pure homing instinct of a 3-year-old, toward whichever room he happened to be in. And Sophia and Lorenzo, without either of them planning it, kept meeting each other in the most ordinary places of that enormous house, beside the open refrigerator at 10 at night, beside the sunlit table at breakfast, beside the small door of Emma's room where he pretended each evening to be passing on his way somewhere else. The small sabotages failed one after the other, and each failure hardened something inside Vivian. What had been a private, painful longing set slowly, like resin in cold air, into something colder and harder and more specific. The jealousy stopped being a feeling. It became a plan she had not yet let herself write down. She began, in the long quiet hours of the night, to think about how a situation might be arranged in which Sophia and Emma would have no choice but to leave, and in which no one, not Lorenzo, not the household, not the sister she was quietly ruining, would ever be able to trace the reason back to her. There is a difference between loving someone and needing to own them. One opens the hand, the other slowly closes it. The plan Vivian had not yet let herself write down was still only a shape in the dark when the storm came. It arrived on a Thursday night in the second week of a cold October. Rain came down against the tall windows of the estate in long, hard sheets, and the wind moved through the poplars along the drive in a low, continuous sound that carried into every room. By 9, most of the house had gone quiet. By 10, only 2 rooms still had a light on. One was Lorenzo's study. The other was the small back room where Sophia had been putting Emma to bed for nearly 2 hours. The child would not settle. She had been fine at supper. She had been fine an hour after. Then she had grown quiet in a way that was not her, and her cheeks had gone from pink to red to something darker. And by 10, her small forehead under Sophia's palm was hot enough to make Sophia's own hand recoil. Sophia stripped her down. Sophia sponged her with cool water. She counted, out loud in a low voice, so that Emma would not hear the fear in it. The thermometer, when she finally read it, said something that did not go down no matter how long she watched. She began, quietly, to panic. Lorenzo, 3 corridors away, heard the sound of hurried footsteps that did not belong to that hour of the house. He was on his feet before he understood why. He crossed the corridors quickly. He pushed open the door of the small back room without knocking. He saw Emma lying limp in the curve of her mother's arm, her honey curls stuck damp to her forehead, her small chest rising and falling too fast under a thin cotton gown. She was pale in a way that made her lips look strange. Her eyes were closed. For a fraction of a second, Lorenzo could not move. The image in front of him lined up too exactly with an image he had spent 6 years refusing to look at. Another small girl. Another still, quiet body he had come too late to. His hand tightened on the door frame. Something in him tried to make him turn around. Then Emma's eyes opened. She saw him. Her small, unfocused gaze found his face across the room, and one thin hand lifted from the blanket toward him, trembling. Uncle Lorenzo. He was across the room in 3 strides. He did not call for the driver. He did not call for anyone. He took Emma from Sophia's arms himself, wrapped her in the wool blanket from the foot of the bed, and told Sophia in a voice that left no room for question to bring her coat and follow him. He carried the child down the west staircase, out the side door, into the sedan waiting under the portico. He drove himself, one hand on the wheel and one still curved around the small bundle in the seat beside him. All the way to the private hospital, the DeLuca family kept on Erie Street. They did not have to wait. Doors opened. People moved. By 11:30, Emma was in a small, pale room with an intravenous line taped along the back of one hand and a monitor whispering above her head. The doctors spoke of infection, of fluids, of hours. They said things would be clearer by morning. Lorenzo did not leave the chair beside the bed. Sophia sat on the far side. She watched him. He did not move. He held Emma's small hand in both of his own the way a man holds the last coin he owns. He did not look like the man the underworld feared. He looked like a father praying without knowing any of the words. Near 5 in the morning, Emma's fever broke. Her small fingers, even in sleep, did not let go of his. Sometime after the fever broke, and before the first gray light began to reach the hospital window, Lorenzo stepped quietly out into the corridor. He did not go far. He only walked as far as the small padded bench across from the door of Emma's room, and there he sat down, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them. He could still see the door from where he was. He needed to still see the door. The corridor at that hour was almost empty. A nurse passed at the far end with a clipboard. A cleaner pushed a soft mop along the tiles somewhere out of sight. Everything else was hush. Lorenzo let his head drop until his forehead rested against the knuckles of his folded hands. He had spent 6 years being certain of one thing above all others. He had told himself that the reason he had begun to soften around this small girl was that she was a shape in the world that resembled a shape he had lost. He had told himself that when he looked at her, he was really looking through her at another child, one who could no longer be looked at. He had allowed his heart that quiet trick because it had felt safer than the alternative. Sitting on that bench in the gray hospital light, he understood, with a clarity that did not spare him, that the trick had run out. He did not love this child because she looked like his daughter. She did not look like his daughter. He loved the way she tilted her head to one side when she was thinking, as though a thought were something heavy she had to physically balance. He loved that she said the word spaghetti wrong every single time and had never once let anyone correct her. He loved that she broke every cookie she was given exactly in half and pushed one of the halves across the desk toward whoever was nearest, even when the nearest person was him. He loved the specific weight of her small hand in his own hand when she was pulling him toward a snail. He loved the sound of the way she breathed when she was sleeping. He loved 100 small, particular things about her that had nothing to do with any child who was gone. She had not replaced anyone. No one could have. She had only, over the course of a few short weeks, taught him something he had refused to know, that the heart he thought had been buried 6 years ago could still, apparently, do the one thing it was built for. He sat with that understanding for a long time. The door of Emma's room opened quietly, and Sophia stepped out. She had a folded hospital blanket around her shoulders, and the look of a woman who had not slept but had, for the first time in many hours, remembered how to breathe. She saw him on the bench. She crossed the corridor. She sat down beside him without asking. They did not say much. She said the doctor had come in. He said he had heard. Then they were quiet. At the DeLuca estate, 3 miles away, the telephone rang in the servants' hall shortly before 6. Vivian answered it. She listened to the brief report from the hospital. She said the correct words in the correct order. She hung up. Then she stood alone in the pantry for a long time with her hand still on the receiver. And she understood, in that quiet, that Lorenzo was no longer only falling in love with a 3-year-old. He was falling in love with her mother. And in the cold place behind Vivian's ribs, the small unwritten plan she had been avoiding began to sharpen its edges. The plan had needed one more thing to become real, and Vivian went looking for it. She did not go by day. She went in the evenings, after her shift, in a plain coat with a scarf pulled up around her chin, and she took the bus back into the neighborhood where she and Sophia had grown up. She stopped at the small grocery on Loomis where her mother had bought bread. She sat for a coffee at the counter of the diner, where a girl she had known in high school still waited tables. She said Sophia's married name in a lowered voice, the way one asks after old friends, and she watched the faces that heard it. It took her less than a week to be handed a name and an address. Joseph was easy to find, because Joseph was, in that autumn, being found by other people. He had lost the small apartment. He had been asked to leave the last cousin's couch. He owed money in 3 neighborhoods now, not one. He had been seen in a card room behind a Polish barber shop, and after that he had been seen limping. When Vivian finally set eyes on him again, in a low, wet-smelling bar on Ashland with sawdust on the floor and a television playing a game with the sound off, he was a thinner and dirtier version of the young man who had once brought her sister a paperback of poems. She waited until the seat next to him was empty, then she took it. He did not recognize her at first. Then he did. "You," he said. He looked at her for a long, slow moment, sizing her the way he would size any woman who chose to sit down beside him uninvited, and then his eyes narrowed. "Sophia's sister. Where the hell is she?" Vivian did not answer him directly. She ordered a drink she had no intention of finishing. She let him fill the silence. He filled it with complaints, about the debts, about the men he owed, about the wife who had walked out on him in the middle of the night, taking his daughter with her, as though a child were something that belonged to the mother only. Vivian listened. She noticed that he had not said the child's name once. Then she leaned a little closer to him over the sticky wood of the bar, and she said, in a low, almost sympathetic tone, "Did you know she is living in Lorenzo DeLuca's house?" Joseph turned toward her fully for the first time. She watched something change behind his eyes. She had expected surprise. She had expected anger. She had not expected the third thing that came into his face, a slow, hungry calculation that had nothing to do with a father missing his child. He was thinking, she realized, of a checkbook. He was thinking of leverage. He was thinking of a way, at last, to make someone pay. Vivian, who had come to this bar wanting exactly that, told herself that this was what she had hoped for. She told herself she only wanted Joseph to appear at the gates. To claim the child, Emma would leave the estate. Sophia would follow. The world would settle back into its proper shape. She did not let herself think about what a man like this had already been willing to do. Over the next several evenings, in that same bar, Joseph asked her a great many careful questions. About the estate, about the schedule of the guards at the servants' gate, about the small garden where Emma most often played, about the days Lorenzo was known to be away. Vivian answered them. All of them. She told herself he only wanted to see his daughter. Joseph did not need to write any of it down. He was memorizing. Everything Joseph had memorized became a plan within a week. He chose a Thursday. It was the day Vivian had, in one of her most careless confidences, mentioned that Lorenzo would be spending the whole afternoon at the shipping offices near the harbor. Joseph had taken note. He waited until early afternoon, until the sun had turned yellow, and the long shadow of the estate wall lay across the front drive, and then he had a friend drive him to the gates in an old gray sedan that trailed a thin plume of blue smoke behind it. The car stopped in the middle of the drive. Joseph got out. He was wearing a jacket that had been pressed and a shirt that had been washed. He had shaved. To anyone who had not known him before, he might almost have passed for a respectable man come to a respectable house on respectable business. He walked up to the wrought iron gates and told the guard at the small kiosk that he was here to collect his daughter. The guard, a broad man named Renzo who had worked the gate for 11 years, did not open anything. He asked, evenly, for a name. Joseph gave him one. Renzo checked a list he did not need to check and told Joseph, in the polite, unmovable tone of a man who has said the same words to hundreds of visitors, that he was not on it. Joseph did not retreat. He took 2 steps back into the middle of the drive, spread his arms wide as though he were making a speech in a public square, and raised his voice. "I am here to collect my daughter," he said, loud enough to carry over the wall, loud enough to carry into the front rooms of the main house. "Her name is Emma. Her mother took her from me in the middle of the night. I want my child." Inside the main house, in the long dining room, Sophia was polishing the length of the walnut table. The cloth in her hand stopped moving. She did not need to hear the words. She recognized the voice. The cloth dropped onto the wood. In the sitting room off the front hall, Emma was on the rug with her tin of crayons, drawing something that involved a great many green lines. Her small head lifted at the sound. Her eyes went round. She was on her feet without a sound and behind her mother's skirts, both small hands fisted in the fabric, before Sophia had reached the front doorway. Joseph was still shouting from the drive. He shouted about legal rights. He shouted about a mother who had run in the night. He shouted that the DeLuca family had no business standing between a father and his child, and that he would go to any court in this city, that he would go to any newspaper, that he would come back with every kind of trouble a man could bring if he had to. Renzo did not open the gate, but he did not have to. At that exact moment, a second car turned into the drive. Lorenzo's sedan slid to a stop behind the old gray one. The meeting at the harbor had ended earlier than expected. Lorenzo stepped out into the yellow afternoon and stood for one long, silent moment, taking in the scene, the stranger in the middle of his drive, the front doorway of his house, and the small figure of Emma pressed, shaking against her mother's legs, her face white. Joseph turned toward him and smiled. "And what are you to her?" he called, deliberately, across the gravel. "You are not her father." Lorenzo did not answer at once. He stood at the threshold of the open gate with his coat still on, and he looked at Joseph for a slow, unhurried count that had nothing kind in it. Emma broke free of Sophia. She ran the whole length of the drive on her small legs, and she flung both arms around Lorenzo's leg and buried her face in the wool of his trousers. Lorenzo laid one hand very gently on the top of her honey curls. He did not look down. He looked straight at Joseph. "I am the person she runs to," he said, quietly and clearly, "when she is afraid of you." Joseph's smile faltered. He looked around at the closed gate, at the driver still in the gray sedan, at Renzo watching him without moving. Then he backed away, one step at a time, toward the car. Before he got in, he pointed a finger at Lorenzo across the drive. "This is not over," he said. Joseph kept his word. 6 days after the gray sedan turned out of the DeLuca drive, a summons was delivered to the front desk of the main house. Joseph had filed a petition for custody of Emma in the family court of Cook County. The document was thick, formal, and, in places, almost skillfully written. Someone had been advising him. By the time of the first hearing, he had made himself into a different man for the benefit of a judge. He had cut his hair, he had shaved cleanly, he had bought, or borrowed, a plain gray suit and a white shirt he ironed himself in a rented room across the river. He had stopped drinking, at least where anyone could see it. He walked into the courthouse on the appointed morning with his hands folded in front of him, his eyes lowered, and the careful posture of a man performing repentance. He had, he told the court, been through a dark chapter. He had lost his job. He had lost his way. He had never stopped loving his daughter. He was ready, now, to rebuild. On the far side of the aisle, Sophia sat in a plain navy dress with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating so hard she was certain the woman beside her could hear it. Lorenzo did not sit beside her. He sat 2 rows behind, in a dark suit, his face unreadable. Emma waited in a small side room with a court social worker and a bowl of orange candies. At home in the estate, Vivian was quietly assembling a second knife. She could not appear at the hearings. She could not be listed as a witness, but she was, more than anyone else in the world, in a position to know when Sophia had come home from a shift so tired she had gone to bed with Emma still awake in the sitting room. She was in a position to know which afternoons Emma had been left in the care of a housemaid rather than her mother. She wrote things down. She passed them, through a cousin she barely trusted, to Joseph's attorney. Joseph's attorney was clever. He did not spend his best fire on Sophia. He spent it on the house she lived in. He asked the court to consider, at some length, where a 3-year-old girl was currently being raised. He named Lorenzo by name. He described the estate. He noted the presence of armed personnel at the gates. He raised, in a careful, sorrowful voice, the possibility of retaliation from unnamed enemies of the DeLuca family, and the fact that a child of Emma's age would be entirely unable to protect herself from any of it. For the first time since Sophia had brought her daughter to those gates, Lorenzo himself had become the argument against her keeping her. That night at the estate, Sophia sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands pressed to her face and began, quietly, to think about leaving. Lorenzo watched her from the doorway. He did not step inside. He did not try to persuade her. He only said, in a low, level voice, that if her leaving was what was needed to keep Emma safe, he would not stand in the way of it. Then the tide turned. Sophia's attorney brought forward, session by session, the record Joseph had thought no one had kept, the unpaid rent notices, the pawn tickets, the affidavit of a neighbor who had heard shouting through a shared wall. The medical file from an emergency room visit Sophia had once explained away with a story about a fall on wet stairs, the name of a loan collector who had, on a certain night, stood in a certain kitchen, when the judge finally asked Emma herself, gently, whom she wished to live with. The little girl blinked up at the tall bench with wide, uncertain eyes. She did not understand most of the question. She understood one thing. "I do not want to go with Daddy Joseph," she said, in a small, clear voice. "Daddy Joseph makes Mama cry." She climbed down from the chair, She ran the length of the aisle and buried her face in Sophia's skirt. Then, after a moment, she turned her small head and looked back into the gallery until she found Lorenzo. She walked to him. She reached up and took his hand. The court awarded Sophia full custody that afternoon. For 11 days after the judge's ruling, the estate breathed as though the danger were behind them. Sophia sang softly again in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. Emma discovered a new corner of the garden, where the last of the autumn strawberries were hiding under their leaves. Lorenzo came home earlier than he ever had. In the evenings, the three of them sat, without quite meaning to. In the same room, Emma on the rug with her tin box open, Sophia with a book she barely turned the pages of, Lorenzo with a folder that had long since gone unread across his knee. They believed the worst had been decided. Joseph believed something else. He had walked out of the courthouse that afternoon with his face still arranged in the shape of the repentant father, and by the time he reached the corner he had let it fall. What he had wanted from Emma had never been Emma. What he had wanted had been the money the child could be traded for. What he had wanted, beneath even that, had been the woman who had once been his to control. Both had slipped out of his hands in a single ruling, and he laid the blame for both of them, entire and unbroken, at Lorenzo De Luca's door. He did not need to be told any new information. He had memorized the old. He remembered, from those long evenings in the bar on Ashland, which small service gate along the eastern wall the maids used when they took out the compost. He remembered which hours of the afternoon the estate ran with a lighter guard. He remembered which small enclosed corner of the garden, sheltered by hedge and low stone wall, was the place a 3-year-old was most often set down to play under the watch of one distracted adult. He chose a Wednesday. It was the day Vivian, in one of her old confidences, had mentioned that Lorenzo could not, under any circumstances, miss a meeting with 3 shipping partners in a private room downtown. That morning Lorenzo left the estate at 10. Sophia was called into the back kitchens at 2:30 to help sort a delivery of preserves that had arrived late from a farm in Wisconsin. Emma was carried out into the small walled garden by a housemaid named Adela, with a bright cotton blanket, her tin of crayons, a stack of paper, and a small china cup of warm milk. The afternoon was cool but bright. The little girl sat cross-legged on the blanket and began, seriously, to draw a house with a red roof. Adela remembered, some minutes into it, that the wind was picking up, and that Sophia had asked her to make sure Emma wore the yellow sun hat if they went outside for any length of time. The hat was on a peg just inside the garden door, no more than 7 steps away. She stood. She walked to the door. She reached for the hat. 30 seconds, perhaps less. Joseph had been standing since morning in the narrow lane behind the eastern service gate, waiting, one hand flat against the low stone wall. He moved fast. He did not have to move far. When Adela turned back with the yellow hat in her hand, the small cotton blanket in the middle of the garden was empty. The stack of paper had blown one sheet loose. The tin of crayons had tipped onto its side. She screamed Emma's name once. She screamed for Sophia. Sophia was through the kitchen door and across the yard before she had entirely understood the sound she had heard. She ran into the small walled garden and stopped as if she had struck a wall of glass. There was no child on the blanket. The tin had spilled its bright colors across the flagstones, and there, rolling slowly on the pale stone in the low autumn light, was a single crayon that had not yet come to rest, a bright, unmistakable green, exactly the color of the line a 3-year-old had drawn, weeks ago now, down the cheek of the most feared man in Chicago. Sophia went down onto her knees on the flagstones. She did not cry at first. She simply reached out one shaking hand and picked up the tin of crayons and began, in a terrible mechanical way, to put the colors back inside it, one by one, as though putting them right would put her daughter right. The green crayon was the last one. She could not close her hand around it. She left it on the stones. Adela was already sobbing behind her. A guard came running from the front of the estate. Someone called for Vivian. Someone else, more quietly, telephoned Lorenzo. The call reached him in a private conference room on the 32nd floor of a building downtown. In the middle of a discussion about the arrival schedule of a container ship from Genoa, the man opposite him was mid-sentence. Lorenzo listened to 12 seconds of the voice in his ear. He set the phone down. He stood up. "Gentlemen," he said, in a tone that made every man at the table close his mouth, "this meeting is over." He was in his car before anyone thought to argue. He drove himself back to the estate at a speed that would have killed a lesser driver. When he stepped through the small walled garden gate, everyone there, Sophia, Adela, 2 guards, a housekeeper standing frozen with a dishcloth in her hand, turned toward him at once, and then, seeing his face, looked away. He walked past all of them. He stopped in the middle of the flagstones. He looked down. The green crayon lay on the pale stone in the low autumn light. For one long moment, Lorenzo De Luca was not the head of a family. He was a man who had, 6 years ago, Come home too late to a house he had believed was safe. Every one of those 6 years came up through him at once. His shoulders moved once, sharply, as though a great weight had shifted inside his ribs. He crouched. He picked up the crayon. His hand, when he did it, was trembling so badly that the small green stick knocked twice against his own knuckles. His men had never seen his hand shake in their lives. But when he stood again, his voice was level. Find her. He looked at the men around him one by one, at any cost. Less than an hour later, the private line in his study rang. Lorenzo picked it up on the second ring. Joseph's voice on the other end was almost pleasant. He confirmed, unhurried, that Emma was with him. He gave a sum of money. He named a make of car. He said the money and the car were to be delivered by dawn, and that he was, at that point, to be permitted to leave the city without pursuit. Then he added the sentence he had been saving. Do this exactly, DeLuca, he said, or you are going to lose another little girl. The room did not move. Sophia, standing at Lorenzo's elbow, made a sound in her throat and pressed both hands flat to her mouth. She had known that Joseph could be cruel. She had not known he had learned enough about Lorenzo's past to aim so precisely. Lorenzo did not answer. He hung up the phone. He stood at his desk with both palms flat against the wood, and he closed his eyes for a count of 3. 6 years ago he had come home too late. 6 years ago the ground under his feet had opened and swallowed everything. Not this time. He was still standing exactly that way when the study door opened, and Vivian stepped in. She was white to the lips. Her hands were shaking worse than his had shaken in the garden. She did not sit down. She told him. All of it. The bar on Ashland. Joseph. The evenings of small, careful questions she had believed were only the questions of a father missing his child. The gate, the schedule, the garden. When she had finished, Lorenzo did not speak. He crossed the room toward her in 3 long strides, and for one terrible instant, he did not look like a man at all. Sophia stepped between them. She did not raise her voice. She said only 2 words, low and flat and absolute. Emma first. Lorenzo stopped. Then Vivian said, in a small, broken voice, the one thing she still had left to give. There is an old warehouse, out past the freight yards. He asked about it more than once. I did not understand why. The warehouse Vivian had named sat almost a mile beyond the last of the freight yards, at the end of a long gravel road that had not been maintained in years. Lorenzo's men reached it within 40 minutes. They came in 3 cars, without headlights, and left them a quarter-mile short. From there they moved on foot through the low weeds. The building was a long, low structure of blackened brick, its windows either broken or covered in old sheet metal, its main sliding door standing partly open. A single dim light burned inside. Lorenzo gathered his men in the shadow of a stack of rotted pallets and gave one order in a voice pitched almost to a whisper. No one fires a shot while she is anywhere near him. No one. I do not care what he does. Not a single shot. He split them into 3 approaches, one to the front, one to the rear service door, one along the collapsed loading dock on the eastern side. They moved into position. Then he walked around to the front alone, in a dark coat, unarmed where any eye could see, both hands held slightly out to the sides. Inside, the warehouse was cold and smelled of oil and damp brick. Joseph was standing near the center of the main floor, under the one working bulb, with a pistol in his right hand and a cigarette unlit in his left. Behind him, on a wooden crate that had once held machine parts, sat Emma. She had drawn her small knees up to her chest. Her cheeks were streaked. She had been crying, quietly and continuously, for a long time. She saw Lorenzo the moment he stepped through the door. "Uncle Lorenzo!" Joseph moved fast. He crossed to her, grabbed her by the upper arm, and pulled her sharply against his side. Lorenzo stopped where he was. For a fraction of a second, the small, trembling shape pressed against Joseph's leg lined up in his mind with a memory he had refused for 6 years. He held that line up and looked at it and understood. This time, the one difference that mattered. The child he was looking at was still breathing. He was not too late. "Put your weapon on the floor," Joseph said, slowly. Lorenzo lifted his coat. He drew the pistol from the small holster at his back with 2 fingers. He lowered it to the concrete floor and slid it a full arm's length away. Then, at Joseph's next command, he stepped a further 2 paces to his left, out of any easy cover, into the middle of the empty floor. Joseph laughed once, low and bitter. "Look at you," he said, "the great DeLuca. Ready to die for a child who is not even yours. She does not need to carry my name to be my daughter." Lorenzo said it evenly, without raising his voice. He was already doing what he needed to do, which was to keep Joseph looking at him. He asked a question next, and another. About the money, about the car, about the road out of the city. Small, steady questions to keep a nervous man's eyes on his face, and not on the small figure at his hip. The minutes worked in Lorenzo's favor. Joseph's hand grew tired. Joseph's other hand, holding the unlit cigarette, wanted something to do. At last, Joseph lowered the pistol a few inches toward his belt, fumbling in his pocket for a lighter. Lorenzo did not wait. "Emma!" His voice cracked across the concrete like a whip. The child moved before Joseph could think. She twisted, she slid, she ran. Joseph's free hand closed on air where her shoulder had been. She crossed the floor on her small legs faster than anyone in that warehouse would have believed possible. And Lorenzo went down on one knee to catch her, folded his coat around her, and turned his own back to the pistol in a single continuous movement. From three sides at once, his men came out of the dark. They took Joseph down cleanly and alive. The pistol clattered across the concrete and stopped a few feet from Lorenzo's discarded one. Lorenzo did not stand up. He stayed on one knee on the cold floor, with Emma pressed against his chest, one of his large hands cupping the back of her small head, the other flat between her shoulder blades. She was sobbing into his collar and could not, let go of the front of his coat. He looked once at Joseph on the ground. His own pistol was within reach. 2 seconds. That was all it would have taken. He looked down instead at the small wet face buried in his shoulder. He would not let this be what she remembered. Joseph would go through the law. For the kidnapping. For all the older things. Lorenzo lifted Emma into his arms and stood. She did not release the front of his coat the entire way out. The gates of the estate were already open when Lorenzo's car turned into the drive. Sophia was standing on the front steps in the pale, cold light of late afternoon. She had not moved from that spot in hours. When she saw the small honey head against Lorenzo's shoulder as he stepped out of the car, she came down those steps at a run. Emma reached for her before Lorenzo had straightened up. Mother and daughter folded into each other on the drive. Sophia on her knees on the gravel, her face pressed into the top of Emma's hair. Both of them crying without any of the small dignities adults usually keep. Lorenzo stood a step behind them and said nothing. After a long moment, Emma lifted her small face from her mother's shoulder. She looked back at Lorenzo, standing there in his dark coat, and she reached one small hand out toward him. Lorenzo lowered himself to his knees on the gravel. Emma leaned forward and, with her small hand still on her mother's sleeve, tugged him gently into the circle of the two of them. No one said the word family out loud. All three of them understood, in that quiet, that it had already been said. Later that evening, in the study, Lorenzo sat across from Vivian for what both of them knew was the last time. He did not raise his voice. He told her that her one act of pointing them toward the warehouse had saved a child's life, and that it was the first true thing she had done in a long while. But it did not, and could not, undo the many small dishonesties that had brought that child into danger in the first place. He asked her to leave the estate by morning. He told her, evenly, that if she ever again did anything that put Sophia or Emma at risk, he would not care whose sister she was. Vivian walked out through the servants' door before dawn, carrying the same small suitcase she had once walked in with. Somewhere between the gate and the bus stop at the end of the road, she understood the truth she had spent years refusing. Lorenzo had never been hers to lose to anyone. What she had lost only to her own inability to let her sister simply be loved. For several days afterward, Sophia moved through the estate quietly, and then, one morning, she began to pack. She had decided she could not raise a child inside walls that had been proven, however briefly, to be reachable. Emma found her mother folding shirts into a bag and understood without being told. That afternoon, for the first time in her small life, Emma walked to the door of Lorenzo's study and knocked. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her small chin was doing the trembling thing it did before tears. "Mama says we have to go," she said. "If we go, will you be alone again?" The question found the last unhealed place in him and pressed there. He went to Sophia that night. He did not offer her money. He did not promise her a life without danger. He only told her, in a plain and unshielded voice, that he loved her, and that he loved Emma as though she were his own. If she stayed, he said, it had to be because she chose him, not because she needed a job, not because she needed a wall around her daughter. Sophia stayed. Some weeks later, on a bright, quiet Sunday, Lorenzo took a key out of a drawer he had not opened in 6 years. He walked, with Emma's small hand in his own, to a door at the end of the west wing that no one in the household had passed through since the funerals. He unlocked it. He opened it. He led the little girl inside and showed her, one by one, the photographs of the wife and the small daughter he had once loved with everything he had. He told her their names. He told her their favorite songs. Emma did not fully understand the shape of what he was telling her. She understood only that he was sad. She wrapped her small arms as far around him as they would go. For the first time in 6 years, Lorenzo wept openly for what he had lost, and did not try to hide it. He understood, at last, that Emma had not replaced anyone. His heart, he discovered, was large enough to hold a child he had lost, and still love a child he had not. 6 years ago, he had come home too late. This time, he had brought his little girl back. A season later, a new young guard was walking past the study when a small figure with honey curls flew past him and pushed the great door open without knocking. He lunged forward, alarmed, to stop her, and was caught firmly by the elbow by an older man beside him. Through the crack of the door, the two of them looked in. Emma had climbed into Lorenzo's lap. She was, with great seriousness, setting a small paper crown on the head of the man the entire underworld feared. On the wall behind them hung a bright, crooked crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands: Sophia, Emma, and Lorenzo. The new guard opened his mouth to protest. The older one only smiled. "That one," he said, "is not just anyone. Dear friends, sometimes love comes back into our lives not through a grand gesture, but through the smallest of doors: a knock, a question, a single crayon line on a cheek. Loving again does not mean forgetting the ones we have lost. It only means allowing our hearts to live again beside their memory. Has there ever been a small person who walked into your life and quietly changed everything about it? We would love to hear about that person in the comments below. Please share your story with us. Every one we read means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. We wish every one of you watching this today good health, peaceful days, and a home full of gentle laughter. May you be surrounded by people who love you the way Emma loved Lorenzo without being asked to. In our next video, the story of a hardened mafia boss who receives a letter from a dying stranger, a letter that will lead him to a child he never knew existed. You will not want to miss it. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you very soon. Goodbye for now.